Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. So glad you can join us this week. And if you're listening to us on one of the many podcast platforms at which you can find us, you can also watch us on YouTube. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can listen to us on one of those platforms. What we ask is that you leave us a review, hit the subscribe button, but most importantly, let your friends know, let your family members know, let everybody in your life know how much you are enjoying the Lunch Hour. Joining me this week, I'm very excited to bring our guest on. His name is Chuck DeVore. He is the Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He writes about the economy, energy, and national security. During session, which is not every year, as I understand, the Texas Legislature frequently invites him to testify on election integrity and other topics. He guides the foundation's national work in border security, election integrity, energy and conservative criminal justice reform. He's authored 3 books: Crisis of the House, Never United, a novel of early America, The Texas Model, Prosperity in the Lone Star State, and Lessons for America. And China Tax. I'm not very good, Chuck, today with my grammar and reading copy. He regularly appears on Fox News and is a senior contributor at the Federalist. For 6 years until he turned out in 2010, DeVore represented almost 500,000 people in the California State Assembly, where he was vice chairman of the Committee on Revenue and Taxation, as well as a member of the Budget Committee. He was a senior assistant to a U.S. congressman in the late 80s, and in the Reagan-era Pentagon, Chuck was a special assistant for foreign affairs. Prior to his election, he was an aerospace executive in the industry for 13 years, analyzing technology and corporate capabilities and working in business development. He retired from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel, having served in both the National Guard and the Reserves, and an intelligence officer. And I know, Chuck, normally I tend to summarize those biographies, but I didn't want to do it in your case because your career is so varied. I think it's important for folks to get a real understanding of it. Let's start with the transition from working in public policy in the Reagan administration, working in the Army, to becoming an elected official. How did that transition go?
Well, in my case, Andrew, I was a volunteer at a pretty young age. I was the head of my college Republican club. I did a lot of precinct walking and phone calling, a heck of a lot of envelope licking and stamping to try to help get people elected. I ended up serving for 10 years on the Orange County Republican Party Central Committee, which is a volunteer position, but often very hard fought over in terms of getting on that Central Committee. I was on it at the time when Orange County, California was probably one of the most important Republican counties in the country, as far as the margin and the ability to occasionally shift California to vote red. And so that was a long period of preparation. So when I ended up running for office, I certainly knew how to run a good campaign, knew how to select a good campaign staff, raise enough money. And in my case, it was a pretty crowded primary field. I think we had about 5 pretty legitimate candidates that were running. About $2 million total spent between the 5. I was outspent about 2 to 1.
Wow.
About $1 million to $500,000, but won by 20 points in a district that at the time was a safe Republican district, and was elected in November of 2004. So I served for 6 years.
And let's talk about that. Let's actually, because you've made the transition from California to Texas. I want to come back and talk about how politics has changed, but let's talk about the migration out of California to Texas. What's going on in California, and what's going right in Texas?
Yeah, so for quite a while, there's been a pretty big disparity between the 2 most populous states when it comes to taxation and regulation, and just a general feeling of live and let live. In California, there's an interesting poll that's run, I think, every other year out of UC Berkeley that asks people, do you want to leave California? Do you really want to leave California? I don't really know what the difference is, but they ask those 2 questions. And then they slice it and dice it demographically by, men and women, by age, by ideological orientation, by income, by education. And what's interesting is pretty much across the entire spectrum, people are thinking about leaving California. But when it comes to people who are conservative or very conservative, which in a state the size of California, almost 40 million people, it's still a lot of people who are conservative, even if it's a shrinking fraction of the population. The number one reason they cite for wanting to leave is the political environment. That's even higher than the heavy taxes or the high cost of living. Now, among the young people in California, it's the high cost of living that they cite is the reason why they want to leave. But in my case personally, as well as in the majority of the people leaving California now, ideology has a lot to do with it. And it's because, Andrew, when you're in a situation where if you're just working at a normal job and you're right of center and you feel the need that you have to walk on eggshells at the office or hold your tongue and really not speak your mind, that can be pretty depressing and demoralizing if that's what you're dealing with day in and day out.
Let me ask you this, Chuck, because I had family out in California. We talked about it. We were hanging out at this conference over the weekend, and I like California a great deal. But I know I couldn't live there because of the regulatory climate, the tax climate, among other things. But it's a beautiful state with a lot of amenities that stem from that beauty, and really regardless of where you are, right? I mean, you could be in Modesto or Merced or Barstow. Yes, I'm going to just name random California towns. No, my point is I'm naming these towns because they're in the Central Valley, and they're not necessarily known for their beauty. But even, a town like San Ardo or King City, has its charm to it. Is the only thing that California really has going for it the natural beauty and the amenities there, that people just love being there and it prevents them from leaving to go to Nevada or Arizona?
Yeah, it's pretty complex, right? So California is certainly a place that is benefiting from an enormous amount of goodwill and infrastructure that's been built up over the years. Hollywood is obviously one of a kind, although increasingly technology is allowing people to recreate a lot of the Hollywood magic elsewhere. Right. Silicon Valley, likewise, a lot of the software and hardware innovation that drives the world today comes out of Silicon Valley. Of course, as much as possible, it's immediately stolen by China and replicated to the degree that they can. But there's a lot of value add. And of course, California's university and state college system is still top flight, right? The UC system, the Cal State system, other colleges. So there's a lot of capital that California has been living on, kind of the foundation of which, of course, has been decades of investment into things like the water infrastructure and the freeway infrastructure, things that frankly haven't been invested in very much in recent years. And so California is really living off of its legacy, which is why what you're seeing now is for 3 years in a row, California hasn't just lost population relative to the rest of the country. It has physically lost population for the first time in its modern history for the last 3 years in a row, and a trend that frankly will likely continue for years to come.
So one of the theses of this movie that's coming out, in fact, when we release this episode, it may have already come out, is this movie. I don't know if have you seen the trailer for this movie, Civil War? It posits a world in which Texas and California have joined together in an alliance against the federal government. I mean, listen, setting all of that aside, setting aside the thesis of the movie, let's talk about the suspension of disbelief in thinking that Texas and California are going to agree to oppose the federal government. Talk about that unholy alliance.
Well, my understanding is the creators of the movie wanted to avoid some of these thorny political questions, so they purposefully put together something that would make it impossible for people like us to figure out where it was coming from, and just kind of wanting to explore how horrific a civil war would be in modern times.
Right.
And with that, I would agree. I mean, it was one of the reasons why I wrote the book Crisis at the House Never United, which looks at our early history and looks at the fact that the Constitution almost wasn't ratified. And so I explore an early history of the U.S. of what could have happened if that was the case and the violence that would ensue. So yeah, that movie, I think, is really based on a few solid concerns. For example, what do you do with this burgeoning federal budget deficit and the fact that now we're paying more than the defense budget in terms of interest service on that debt? The fact that you seem to have migratory patterns within the country that are reinforcing blue and red states. In other words, rather than living amongst your neighbors who might disagree with you, people are increasingly becoming inclined to move where liberal-minded people would move to places like New York and California, and conservative-minded people would move to places like Texas and Florida. And so we seem to be pulling apart, perhaps on an accelerated basis. I would argue that some of this has to do with the fact that we've had decades now where the federal government insists on leveling the differences between states and trying to impose a unitary vision upon the country, trying to flatten the differences between places like Texas and California. I would argue that the whole point of federalism is to allow for a federal republic where the states can experiment and where they can have some differences and people can live in peace and enjoy those differences.
So you're a retired intelligence officer. You retired as a lieutenant colonel. And so I'm going to posit this to you with that hat on. Because I made this thesis over the weekend, which is, and it's one that I've said many, many times before, that the differences that we have, the divisions we have today, are by design, whether or not it's the current climate in which China is spending huge resources to turn us against one another, or the 6 decades prior in which first the Soviets and then the Russians were spending a huge amount of resources to turn us against one another. Where do you fall in this in terms of our enemies serving to rend the fabric of American society?
Right. Well, so this is a tactic that is pretty much as old as time itself, right?
Sure.
You go back to the advent of the country and you had agents provocateurs from the French Revolution that were stirring things up, trying to reinforce the Democratic Republicans and go up against the Federalists who were more in line with Great Britain. So this is something that's been going on for quite some time. The big difference, of course, now is that with the advent of modern technology, with things like TikTok, which is a company owned by ByteDance, which is a company in China that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so now you have a large share of the American public, especially the young, getting their news from TikTok, where the algorithms are literally optimized to push a certain view of America that's favorable to the Chinese Communist Party and not so favorable to America and rule of law and the continuance of our Constitution. So I think that our enemies certainly have greater resources, greater tools than they've ever before possessed. And I think it's important more than ever that Americans kind of dig deep into their civic heritage and their heritage of liberty that we've been blessed with for well over 200 years, and to understand that certainly far more unite us than should divide us.
You know, it's interesting. I know we've had a lot of episodes of this podcast talking about a particular healthcare intellectual property issue called by the Bayh-Dole Act and the March-in provision. I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with a guy named David Kappas about this. And I got, I had posted a short clip from this interview that I did. And I got some pushback from a guy who I didn't know at the time, but is a major activist on healthcare issues and intellectual property. And he is someone who is advocating for a fundamental shift in how we protect the intellectual property rights of patent creators, especially folks coming out of universities. He wants to turn that system on its head in the name of instituting price controls on drugs. And there's a point to this story, Chuck, I promise you. And I'm peeling back a little bit about this person, as I'd never heard of him before, but I've been told by folks that he's a major player. And I come to find out first that his organization is receiving heavy donations and has received heavy donations over the years from the George Soros affiliated foundations like the Open Society Foundation. And that is also being supported and has been supported in the past by the German government to make this advocacy. And it's amazing to me that we as American consumers of information, right? We've just spent some time talking about free speech issues. I won't go into great detail, but about the question of misinformation and disinformation. And yet we are doing scarcely little in America to deal with the agents provocateur who are within our midst, who are doing great damage by supporting organizations who are doing the very work that they themselves want to do. Your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think that we need to put some teeth back into the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is, of course, a World War II act, as I recall, that made it easier to track down at that time, of course, people who were acting on behalf of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. The problem with it is there's been very, very little enforcement, and what little we've had in recent times has been very selective to essentially be used as political prosecutions. I believe that it would be wise for states to look into instituting state FARA acts. In my role as a board member of State Armor, a group that is very concerned about the ongoing penetration of American public institutions by the People's Republic of China, we've been urging states to essentially create the equivalent of a federal FARA Act that would require lobbyists who register with a state to indicate whether or not they are, in fact, acting on behalf of foreign interests, whether foreign companies or governments, and that there should be strict penalties, that if you don't comply with these registration requirements, that you could face some serious prison time. And then that would make it easier, I think, then for the public to make their own determination. Like in this case of the individual you were talking about, presumably there'd be a database and it'd be pretty easy to find out who was paying him. And then you'd think, oh, okay, he's advocating this position because it would benefit some of these foreign powers. I mean, obviously, one of the areas where the U.S. continues to maintain its lead is in the development of new pharmaceutical products, many of which improve the quality of life and improve lifespans. But they're not cheap to make, and they're especially not cheap with our regulatory regime, with the Food and Drug Administration that often tacks on billions of dollars of additional costs, as well as years and years of time before we can bring drugs to market.
And they're not cheap to make when you have to sell them at a loss in foreign countries, which do have massive price controls. So it's, the U.S. citizenry winds up footing the bill. And yet what does this guy want to do? He wants to completely gut our system here, which is just amazing to me. It's funny. I'm reminded of another story there, Chuck, which is when I first moved back to Williamsburg, Virginia a few years ago, William and Mary was, and I don't know if they still have an outcropping of the Confucius Institute, but they did then, and they were offering up these special Chinese cooking classes with a very famous Chinese chef and restaurateur, and I jumped at the chance. I didn't know any better about the Confucius Institute. And then there was a young girl who was homeschooled, who was a part of this group that was learning Chinese cooking. And they took an immediate interest in her, and they started offering her up free Chinese language lessons and the opportunity to go over to China. And that's when I started to get a little disturbed as she started to become a mouthpiece for this organization here. Talk about the Confucius Institute and the concerns that we all ought to have on what's going on college campuses.
So there's been a fair amount of pushback against the Confucius Institutes across the country over the past 5 or 6 years. Many of them have been removed from state campuses. A lot of them have now shifted to high schools or other institutions, so they're still out there.
Wow.
They serve 3 basic purposes, and it's very important for people to understand that the Confucius Institutes are just one aspect of China's attempts to essentially push its national security interests in other countries. So here's the 3 things that they do. The first thing that they do is what you just described. They try to improve cultural appreciation for the People's Republic of China. Yes. Exactly. They're trying to burnish their image. The second thing they do is they keep tabs of Chinese students that are studying overseas. They want to make sure these students don't join any sort of group that might protest, for example, China's mistreatment of the Muslim minority, the Uyghurs, or somehow join a protest about a free and independent Tibet or Taiwan. So they're keeping an eye on these students. They're also ensuring that these students know when they are called upon that they are required under Chinese law to conduct espionage. And that leads into the third issue, which are that they are beachheads to steal our intellectual property. So what you'll often see with these Confucius Institutes is that they will often be at top flight research institutions where the federal government and the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is funding very sophisticated and classified research that these individuals will often figure out ways of getting on these programs. And then they'll steal the intellectual property and bring them back with them to China illegally. So those are the three things that these groups do. They're part of what the Chinese call United Front organizations. These are groups that would include, for example, you've probably heard, your viewers have heard about these Chinese police stations that are secret police stations around the world. In fact, the president of Hungary just agreed to, or the prime minister just agreed to an arrangement with China to bring these police stations into Hungary, so they're not so secret in Hungary, but ostensibly to help Chinese tourists. But the real reason, of course, is to make sure that any Chinese nationals abroad know that their big brother government is watching them, and know that at any time that government requests, they are required under Chinese law, upon penalty of imprisonment and even execution, to conduct espionage on behalf of the Chinese government.
Well, I was going to make a comment about Viktor Orban. Let me set that aside for a minute. So, I'm a nominally a free marketeer. I'm someone who has always believed in free markets and free trade. Obviously, I could talk about that in the abstract terms, the general terms. When we get down to specifics, it's another thing. But one of the things that our colleagues in the libertarian movement, the smaller libertarian movement, Chuck, talked about for a very long time was how free trade and the freest exchange of goods and services across borders would bring greater levels of freedom to places like Russia and China. And I'm someone who believed that for a very long time. I'm willing to admit that I was wrong, but I want to get your thoughts as to whether or not we were all wrong about this.
Well, I think certainly in the case of China, the events of what it was a January or June 6th, I think it was 1989, Tiananmen Square should have disabused anyone of the notion that the Chinese Communist Party was capable of reform. That was the time when their Deng Xiaoping, their paramount leader, said that the strategy of China was to grow strong and bide its time, or hide its strength and bide its time. So in other words, he knew that they needed to do a lot of building with modern technology and manufacturing and the state of their military, and while doing so, to keep a low profile and to act like they were harmless. Well, that time is over with, and under Xi Jinping, they are obviously flexing their muscles. China now has a shipbuilding capacity about 250 times that of the United States. We still have a tonnage advantage of vessels afloat in the ocean, but they're rapidly catching up and should surpass the U.S. Navy's tonnage within about 2 years. And so I would argue that, yes, trade can have salutary effects, but I'm reminded that the intellectuals of the time in 1913 said the same thing about Western Europe on the verge of World War I. They said that the trade that was binding Europe at the time was too important, was too valuable, and that countries would never go to war against each other as they had in the past. And of course, the guns of August had their own brutal logic in August of 1914 that seemed to put an end to that fantasy pretty quickly.
I hadn't planned on asking this, but I'm going to ask, I think you would have an answer to this. Where do you come down on the importance of the Jones Act? Is it a valuable tool in protecting American interests and national security interests, or is it a relic of times past and should be thrown out as an impediment to trade and the serving of American ports?
Yeah, I think we need to revisit how we do it, because clearly it's not functioning per its initial intent, right? So if you look at the number of U.S.-owned ships that are under flags of convenience because they have lower standards of both manning as well as inspections, it's not working. So it seems to me we need to look at a redesign. We probably should have a certain standard of ships that come calling at any American port, and try to eliminate the advantage that people seem to have by using a flag of convenience. My understanding, by the way, was that flags of convenience really got their start during Prohibition, where it was possible to put a flag of convenience of a nation that didn't have Prohibition, and you sail out into international waters, and voila, you can have as much alcohol as you want. And so that seems to be where things really got their start. But yeah, I think that regardless of whether you're for or against the Jones Act, if you look at the underlying reason for it, clearly it has failed. And if you look at the fact that China, South Korea, and other nations have a far greater shipbuilding capacity than does the United States, where we've completely atrophied in our ability to build our own shipping, both commercial and military, it seems to me that we need to get smart very quickly and engage in a crash program to rebuild this vital capacity, because even though the U.S. is a continental power, we are even more so a maritime power, and we ignore the oceans at our peril. And I say this as an Army officer. I think the most important branch and the most difficult branch to maintain and build is the Navy. It takes years to build a ship. I can build an Army division in less than a year.
I think you and I both read while we were undergraduates Alfred Thayer Mahan's Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And that it's a very, I mean, am I right here? Was that influential on you as well?
Who hasn't read Thayer? Come on.
Well, I mean, a lot of folks, believe me, it would surprise you, but it is not the first time it has come up on this show. Let's talk a little bit more about China and soft power abroad. Again, getting to the maritime issue, right? It's not just that they are building infrastructure in countries and then repossessing them. They're also building that infrastructure at strategic choke points around the world. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so China, who of course has traditionally been a land power, is very much following the path of Imperial Germany prior to World War I, in that they are building an overseas empire. Right. And when you do that, and when you have an economy that is predicated on access to foreign markets and exporting large amounts of manufactured goods and importing raw materials, you begin to get interested in controlling the seas. And it's not enough, because of their ideological bent with the Chinese Communist Party, it's not enough to rely on the United States or Western powers to maintain freedom of navigation. If you're going to be hostile to the existing world order, you've got to start building your own capacity to protect that shipping. And so what you're seeing China do, very much like the old imperial powers of the West prior to World War II, they are building significant amounts of infrastructure around the world in areas where they have raw materials that they would like to access, as well as key choke points, such that they can defend or at least put in a good effort at defending the traffic of their shipping, their cargo, their commerce, as they're importing raw materials and exporting finished products. They are, of course, as you mentioned, oftentimes enticing nations with their Belt and Road Initiative, with terms that, frankly, aren't particularly fair for the nation, but because of corruption, they're paying off corrupt leaders and entering into these deals. And then when the little country can't pay, they're repossessing the property under the terms of the lease and basically owning significant port facilities around the world. Now, I think they may run into some trouble when they try this in Africa. In Africa, of course, you have a recent memory of having ejected European colonizers. And I would imagine that the African leadership and people will look at the Chinese investments the same way and will probably resort to violence if the Chinese try to repossess them. But
unless the Chinese Communist Party buys everybody off. I mean, that's my, whether it's money or trinkets.
At some point that gets really expensive, right? And so just like we have a huge problem with our massive federal deficit and debt, China, of course, is also having a huge problem, and from a GDP standpoint is likely to be even more indebted than the United States. So they may be running out of runway right now insofar as this strategy. We'll see in the next couple of years, I'm afraid.
And we should do whatever we can to hasten that, I would think. Let me turn our attention back to Central Europe for a moment, because You and I both came of age during the Cold War. I think the Cold War policies influenced a lot of both of our early work. So there is this war going on, obviously, in Central Europe between Russia and Ukraine. Every once in a while, the Biden administration says they're going to roll out new sanctions against Russia, which makes me wonder, well, why didn't we roll out these sanctions before? But my question comes to petrochemical energy, Chuck. Why isn't the United States doing whatever it can to bottom out the Russian economy by producing as much oil as possible? Is it really climate change uber alles? What say you?
Well, I think the Biden administration is caught between a rock and a hard place. And you see this not only with the Russian Federation, but you see it with the Islamic Republic of Iran. In both cases, you have large oil producers and exporters that the Biden administration actually relaxed sanctions on, certainly with Iran, and certainly, as you point out, with Putin's Russia, failed to enact sanctions that were strong enough to prevent the export of Russian oil around the world. And the reason why they did that, you saw a glimpse of in the run-up to the 2022 midterm elections, when President Joe Biden very irresponsibly virtually drained the entire U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an attempt to keep gasoline prices low prior to the 2022 election. Now, America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve is lower than it's been since just a few years after its creation, I think 1983, 84 or so levels. It's just about completely depleted. And now you see us having the worst of both worlds, right? With the price of energy going up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics just issued its consumer price index this morning. And we see, of course, that energy prices are going up at a double-digit rate, about 13% per year, if I remember my compounding math correctly. And so what's happening is that the Biden administration has been putting a thumb on U.S. domestic energy production, both from a regulatory standpoint, access to capital, things like the new Securities and Exchange Commission rule on climate change. In spite of that, America continues to export more energy than it imports. We are, in fact, energy independent, even though we are importing more oil than we export, largely due to the issue of refineries and which oil is best for those refineries to use. But if you include coal, we're exporting more energy than we're importing. The problem is, as you point out, is that it's not enough to keep prices low. And it would be even worse if Biden were to crack down on Iran and Russia. Right. You would see oil prices surge at least another 20, 30, 50%. The price of gasoline nationwide would probably go up to an average of $4.50 to $5 a gallon. And that would definitely ensure the loss of Joe Biden in the 2024 presidential election and the subsequent election of former President Donald Trump. And so because of that, I think because of politics, you're seeing this administration not use all of the tools at its disposal to try to deny Russia a very important benefit in the prosecution of their war against Ukraine.
It is astounding to me how short-sighted this can be. Chuck, I want to go back to the 3 books. I mean, we've been talking about China. I want to hear more about the book about the time of the American founding. The title again?
The title is Crisis of the House Never United. It's a homage to the late Professor Harry Jeffrey, who wrote The Crisis of the House Divided, of course, taking that from an Abraham Lincoln speech. I think it was, if I remember correctly, his first inaugural. I may be wrong on that.
A house divided upon itself cannot stand.
And then the subsequent book was A New Birth of Freedom. And so in this 2-volume book, Harry Jaffa lays out the founding philosophy of the United States and the premise that we are all born with certain inalienable rights, and it's the duty of the federal government to secure these rights. And so when I went through the Claremont Institute's Lincoln Fellowship program now 20 years ago this year, I learned at that 8-day seminar that the ratification of the Constitution was a very nearly run thing. It almost didn't happen. Something that we certainly aren't taught. It's almost like it was a foregone conclusion when I learned about it. And so I got to thinking, what would have happened if the Anti-Federalists succeeded? What would have happened to the country if things didn't work out? And so I I used my military intelligence and amateur historian hat, and I imagined a United States where that didn't happen. And the Articles of Confederation just kind of muddled through until 1799, which is when George Washington died. And at that point, the last remaining glue that kind of held things together dissolved. And in my book, you'll see that none other than Aaron Burr sees his chance.
That's right.
And he runs for election using national popular vote rather than the Electoral College, and gets himself elected to a rump republic of New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Delaware.
Wow.
And as soon as that happens, of course, the things that were foretold by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers start to happen, which is that they predicted that if we didn't ratify the Constitution, we would break apart into 2 or 3 separate republics, each, of course, seeking aid and alliance with the major European powers. And so, as one might expect, Aaron Burr looks to Napoleon's France and enters into an alliance, and the rest, you'll have to check it out by checking out the book.
I am always fascinated by alternative history. I was a big fan of Harry Turtledove's The Guns of the South book. Not so much a fan later on of the other books, which envisioned an America that continues to be divided, I think, at some point in time. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, and again, I don't want you to give anything away from the books, but do you think that America has not a predetermined way of going, but do you think that Americans have a tendency towards unity or towards disunity?
Yeah, that's a great question because, of course, it's been fraught over the years, right? It was a hard thing to get together, even to create the Constitution. It took Shays' Rebellion and some other civil unrest to kind of rattle the leaders of the day into action. And then, of course, certain issues were buried because if we demanded to resolve the issue of slavery at the time, we never would have had a country.
Right.
In fact, the New Hampshire effort to ratify the Constitution with the convention, it was held in Exeter in February, and it actually failed. This is about a week after it passed in Boston with the proviso that there'd be a Bill of Rights. And everyone figured that the Patriots in New Hampshire would have it together and it would pass. And the Federalists even did a dirty trick by holding it in the coastal town of Exeter during the winter, knowing that the anti-Federalist farmers wouldn't be able to easily get to the convention site through ice and snow from the north and the west. And still it didn't work. And the ostensible reason why it didn't work is a very powerful speaker arose and said, I don't want to be part of any sort of nation that has slavery as part of its founding premise. And so they were about to vote it down and reject it, but they barely were able to pull out at the last minute and simply adjourn until June and try again. And so we've had all kinds of things that have stood in our way, and certainly it took the Civil War itself before the typical American referred to the United States rather than the United States, right?
Yes.
I mean, these
United States versus the United States, yeah,
exactly, because they viewed the states as the prime sovereign unit, right?
Yes.
And so this has been a continuous challenge and struggle, I think, for our nation, which is why the founders built the system they did. They understood that if you were going to have a large continental republic, that you had to have a light yoke of government at the national level, and you really had to allow states to allow for regional distinctions and differences. And I think by and large, over the last 100 years, we've been getting away from that. We've been more centralizing than is good for our size and our nature.
You know, when I was teaching on the regulatory process, one of the very first exercises I would do with my students was I would have them go as a homework assignment, go and visit regulations.gov, which is, of course, folks, this is the website where all the regulatory proposals are put out there. And one among the other ways you can examine it is you can look at regulations that have just come, or proposals that have just come open for comment, and regulations that are coming closed for comment in the coming week. And I would have them pick one from column A and one from column B, and we would bring them and I would have them present them. We put them up on the big board, Chuck, and the idea was, A, to get them familiar with regulations.gov, but it was also to get them to understand just the breadth of things that the federal government was involved in, from the designation of an endangered squirrel in the eastern range of Colorado to drawbridge schedules on the Intercoastal Waterway in Florida, to crop supports and advertising for pecans in California, all of these things. And that was important. So listen, let me ask you this.
Can I dwell on that just a second? I wrote a paper a few years ago called the Soft Tyranny Index, and what I did is I looked at the amount of federal spending as a share of the economy. I looked at taxes, and then I looked at the Federal Register. What you just said, what you made your students go through because you're a terrible man and clearly delight in seeing discomfort in others.
How bad of me, yes.
And so if you go back and you look at the history of this thing and you see kind of the initial jump in regulations during the Roosevelt time, and then it just kind of muddles through, doesn't really do much. And then under Nixon, you see this explosion of regulations as we begin to really develop the administrative state. And the interesting thing about regulations, of course, is that, regulations generally apply to the whole country. And so you have a small cadre of bureaucrats that can really weld a lot of power. And as you know, with most of these regulations, they are enlisting the police power of the states to help them enforce these regulations, because the federal government just doesn't have enough enforcement personnel by itself. And so the Soft Tyranny Index was a very sobering exercise. And I find it really interesting that one of the things that former President Trump did in his administration is they made it an objective, a mandate that for every regulation that was created, they'd get rid of at least two. Right. And as I recall, they did far better than that. And of course, would have had an extremely salutary effect on the economy.
Well, the bottom line is, and again, we're talking about numbers today, we also discovered that the Trump tax cuts actually would have balanced the budget, had we not, hit the gas pedal on spending. Part of that has to do with also the regulatory climate and the certainty that folks have. One of the things that I talk about is the regulatory glide path, the idea that if we simply don't add to the regulatory state, there are tremendous economic gains to be had from this. Yes, a $3 trillion, first of all, when Joe Biden came into office, it was a $2.25 trillion regulatory state. That's bad. $3 trillion is far worse. But even that, if we just kept it constant between now and 2030, and we don't wind up at a $7 trillion regulatory state, there are enormous benefits to be gained from that. This is what you're talking about here. And you and I should talk about this Soft Tyranny Index a little more.
Yeah, it was a fun project. I need to go back and update it. But one of the interesting things that I found in my research is that in recent years, of course, the federal government has outsourced a lot of its basic functions, to contractors. Things as simple as building maintenance or taking out the trash and things like that. And what that is allowed for is kind of this misconception about the size of the federal workforce. What's happened over the years is the federal workforce has gotten much more white collar, much more managerial, much more professional, much higher percentage of people with law degrees and advanced degrees, postgraduate degrees, compared to in the past, where the workforce was much more balanced with a significant share of blue collar workers. And so while some people may argue, well, the federal workforce has not really grown very much, the fact is that person per person, that federal workforce is far, far more powerful, far more educated than it was in the past. And that education translates into reams and reams and reams of regulations that regulate every last aspect of our lives. Right. And as a result, make the economy far less efficient.
About 1 million to 1.5 million separate mandates on the books. And we know that for every dollar in direct regulatory cost, there's a $19 multiplier in lost opportunity cost. Chuck, let me shift gears for a second and sort of end this on a more fun note. I like to talk about the outside interests that my guests have. In fact, I almost did a podcast entitled that. I note you just grew your first Texas apple. You have a green thumb or what else? Or when you're not doing this kind of work, what are you up to?
Yeah. So, between time as a lawmaker and now working at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for a little over 12 years, right? These are office jobs. And, you're in front of a computer, you're reading, you're writing, you're thinking, you're arguing with people. Well, about 25 miles outside of town, I've got my little spread of 1.2 acres, and I've got a well. I've got chickens that I keep in a chicken coop I built myself. That's pretty glorious. Has a wind vane on the top of it. A little bell tower on it.
Excellent.
And I grow spices and tomatoes and potatoes and all kinds of fun things. And the apples and the peaches have been a particular challenge for me, because I learned just in the last few months that the Texas Hill Country, which used to be ancient sea bottom, so it's got a really terrible soil that we call caliche, that it is the home of something called cotton root rot, which, as you might guess, is pretty bad if you want to plant cotton. But it also goes after fruit trees. And so you have to put down fungicide if you want a fruit tree to last. And so I was wondering why some of my prior fruit trees had died after a year and a half or 2 years with little bits of fungus growing out of their dead trunks, and it's like, what the heck is going on here? And so I finally figured it out. And I continue to hope against a practical experience that someday I might actually get a few consistent crops. I even planted a bunch of olive trees and got one decent crop of olives. And then we had that terrible ice storm where things hit a record low down to like 4 degrees for 3 days in a row. And it basically killed all 3 of my olive trees down to the root level. So I think that the only thing that I have that grows very well in Texas so far are my fig trees. And so I get a lot of good figs. So at least that.
All I know is, listen, we were talking about the beauty of California, and next to California, the Texas Hill Country is some of my favorite country in the world. I love going there. One of the things that I quip with my family is, I don't know if you know about the German history of the settlement.
Yes. Yeah.
So I can only imagine when the first German settlers came to the Hill Country, and I'm assuming they came in the fall, in the winter when the weather was glorious. And then the spring comes, and the spring's nice, but it's short. And then as the temperatures crept to 90, 95, 100, 105, how they must have just sworn in German about that. But that's great stuff.
What have we done?
What have we done? This Prince Solms, what did he do? He duped us into coming here. Chuck, how do folks find out more about the good work that the Texas Public Policy Foundation is doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We're at texaspolicy.com, and you can follow me on X at Chuck DeVore.
DeVore is how you spell Chuck's last name. Chuck, listen, thank you so very much for joining us this week.
Thank you.
Folks, this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As always, you can find us on all major podcast platforms. If you're listening to us there, you can also watch us on our YouTube channel. Leave a like, leave a subscription, leave a review. Tell everyone you know about it. The word of mouth is what helps us let more folks know about it. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Thanks as always for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.